So when I think about voter disfranchisement here in New York State in particular, first of all, I recognize that New York State is much more nuanced about the voting opportunities for people who've been involved in the criminal justice system, in that after a person exits parole, they have the eligibility to register and be able to vote. Unlike some other states, especially states in the South, which require that a person either never be able to vote again or that they have to get a pardon from some governing body, whether it's the executive, the governor's office, or the parole board, to be able to get their right back to vote, which obviously can be a totally arduous process and almost impossible for people who've been involved in the criminal justice system. However, my criticism of New York State's approach is that the same nuance that appears to be progressive because we don't take the vote away forever actually is the same nuance that confuses many people who are involved in this process, whether it be people who are directly affected, who don't understand that they get the vote back because they may watch CNN, for instance, and think that they don't ever have the right to vote because of what they see in other states, or because they just get misinformation, and that misinformation often comes from parole or probation, and sometimes comes from the Board of Elections, the actual agency in New York that's in the business of enfranchising people. Like most other people, unfortunately don't know the difference between parole and probation, and therefore give out misinformation about people's rights to vote. And in short, the rule in New York, the law in New York says, if you're convicted and sentenced for a felony and you're in a correctional facility, you cannot vote. If you are on parole, you cannot vote. So if you're sentenced to probation, you actually never lose your right to vote. Most people don't know the difference between parole and probation, unfortunately. And again, once you're released from parole, the day after, quite literally, you don't need a certificate of relief from disability, you don't need a pardon, you don't need a letter from your parole officer, you don't need any of those things. You can actually just register and vote just like anyone else. And so here in New York, what the Fortune Society has worked on is a bill that would return the right to vote for people who've been involved in the criminal justice system the day they step out of a correctional facility onto parole. So the Fortune Society, as a response to what we see as the problems with the current law, namely that people who should be helping people register to vote don't really understand what the process is, and people who have been involved in the criminal justice system unfortunately get confused also, we've drafted a bill that would return the right to vote for anyone once they exit a correctional facility automatically. So the idea is that if a person puts in an application to be able to vote, the Board of Elections wouldn't have to wonder whether it's probation or parole, or as long as you're sending an application from the community and you're attesting to the fact that you have the right to vote, they would register you to vote just like anyone else. And I think that would eliminate a lot of the confusion that we're seeing currently with the nuance that we have in the law. Ultimately, we'd love to be like Maine or Vermont, where people never lose their right to vote based on being sentenced for a felony, but I think that would be a huge lift, especially for New York State's legislature with a much more conservative Senate usually in place. So we think that this is a sort of fallback position that passes the laugh test and has a chance of moving forward in Albany. Having said that, we have supported other bills in the past. Namely, about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago at this point, there was a bill introduced by the New York City Bar Association that responded to the fact that all these agencies don't really do a good job of educating people about their right to vote and register, and helping them to register. And so the bill, the language of the bill required the Board of Elections to provide information to the Department of Correction, probation, parole, and essentially required those same agencies to educate people about their right to vote once they become eligible. So if a person's exiting parole, parole should be providing people with applications and telling them about their voting rights. Probation, for instance, should constantly be providing people with applications and telling them about their voting rights, because they never lose the right to vote while they're on probation. And then correction, for instance, if a person is maxing out, leaving a facility with no time on parole, should be telling people about their right to vote and giving them a voter application on their way out. This bill passed a couple of years ago, was signed by the governor. I think it's a step in the right direction, but I'm also not Pollyannish about this, and just because you change the law doesn't mean you change people's behaviors. So I think implementation of the bill is just as important as the passage of the bill. And so as advocates, we need to make sure that while the bill is passed, that we're pushing these various departments to do a better job. And the idea is that if you have large amounts of people of color being incarcerated from very specific communities, and most people don't realize that even though we have 56,000 people in prison here in New York State, the truth is that half of them come from New York City, and they come from seven very specific communities in New York City. The truth is that if you really think about it, if you're locking up large numbers of young black men and black women from these communities, then you get what's called voter dilution. And so the same communities that probably need the most political representation so that they have the resources to deal with the fact that they have a lot of their residents who are involved in the criminal justice system, unfortunately become the same communities that have the least amount of political representation, because those communities unfortunately have a huge drain of potential voters that can help influence policymakers to bring those resources to the community.